Welcome to everyone with us here today and those of you who are joining us via our recording. We have two items that are posted this week. And the first is the question, what is inference-based CBT and how is it used in OCD treatment? I asked the question because I don't know the answer. And Heather has been doing some work in this direction and graciously volunteered to share a bit of what she has found out. So I'll hand things over to you, Heather.
Thank you. Thanks so much. It's great to be back. And yeah, I appreciate this opportunity because I am a learner here. I'm definitely not an expert. I'm actually wondering, is anyone here familiar with or practice inference-based? Oh, Kim, great. So Kim, feel free to correct me, redirect me, add on. Necessity is a mother of invention. I was referred someone who at the time had was really kind of incapacitated by OCD, and I actually started looking for referrals. And then things settled down, and I think there were a lot of reasons for this person to actually see me, no small part that she could actually see me in person, and our alliance was otherwise good. And so it felt like with enough support, it might be something I could learn to do with her. And then, as it happens, then two other patients suddenly appeared with OCD. So I'm getting a lot of sort of initial practice with this method. But yeah, I don't consider myself an expert. So it's really great to be able to kind of summarize what I've learned to you because that helps my own learning. So the classic treatments for OCD include regular CBT with especially with exposure and response prevention. That's where the person gets triggered to want to do their compulsions, and they inhibit themselves from doing the compulsions, and they allow themselves to sit with all the discomfort of not doing the compulsion. And from that, they learn both to tolerate their distress and learn that nothing terrible happens if they don't obey their compulsions. And that can work remarkably well. Of course, in Feeling Great, David has a case of a woman he cured in one session by getting her to put her hands in the garbage can. Um, David also uses the hidden emotion technique in OCD. This is where the idea that one emotion may not feel safe to be felt, so it gets manifest as either anxiety or as a compulsion. Often it's anger. And that if you can identify that underlying emotion and the person can handle that skillfully, then the OCD can go away. Um, I've used a fair amount of ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy with OCD, helping people instead of trying to engage with the content of thoughts, which can sometimes paradoxically worsen OCD, especially if someone ruminates. If they start to challenge the content of their thoughts, they actually can worsen rumination. They get more tangled. So the diffusion techniques of of unhooking from thoughts, identifying with them as thoughts, and not engaging so much in the content of them can be very helpful and powerful. So inference-based CBT is a newer treatment. I think it's been studied for quite a number of years, but it's certainly newer to me. And there are four randomized controlled trials of inference-based CBT, all of which showed it to be effective. They weren't compared against placebo. So I don't know that any of them met the non-inferiority threshold, but patients in all groups improved. And so Daniel can probably explain what a non-inferiority trial means. But basically, it wasn't aimed to beat the comparative treatment, but it didn't quite meet statistical threshold to show that it wasn't worse. But if you look at the overall picture, everybody got better. So what is inference-based CBT? So to explain this, I think the traditional view of OCD is that there's a trigger, which is usually some kind of intrusive thought, and that creates distress, and then you get a compulsion. And then by acting on the compulsion, you tend to exacerbate the cycle because you're kind of reinforcing the belief in the original thoughts. So inference-based CBT postulates that there's another step, which they call the obsessional doubt. And this gets a little jargony, so bear with me. But the obsessional doubt is some question, some urgent doubt that must be resolved. So, for example, if someone has contamination phobia, they might have the doubt, what if my hands aren't clean? And then from that come all these feared consequences of I could get sick and it's gross and I could spread it everywhere. And then there's the emotional distress of disgust and anxiety, and then the compulsion to wash hands. Um, and so, like if you think of regular CBT, would go into the probably the feared consequences, looking at all the thoughts, like, if my hands are dirty, I might get sick and I might spread it. And traditional CBT would try to change the content of those thoughts. But as we've said, if you engage with that content with someone with OCD, it can paradoxically worsen the rumination. And what inference-based CBT folks would say is because you're accepting the original doubt as possibly real. And so the idea is that OCD is actually, the doubt is false. It's not a real valid doubt. And so what you want to help people understand is how the mind constructs this doubt and creates this vivid experience of it being real. So we have these incredible brains that are capable of imagination and developing possibilities and telling stories. And in normal reasoning, we have images and ideas and possibilities floating into our head all the time, but we filter that by using the senses. So this is our physical senses, what we can see, what we can hear, our common sense, right? Our kind of collective wisdom of, what makes common sense in our lived experience and the people around us. In our inner senses, right? Our own awareness of our emotions and desires and intentions. And then something they call the real self, which is, hold on a second, I want to use the correct language. A common sense understanding of who you are according to your everyday actions, principles, and values and roles. And so your mind can create all sorts of scenarios like, what if my hair is blue? Well, I'm not going to get hung up on that thought because I can look in the mirror and my hair's not blue. And I know I didn't dye my hair recently and I don't get stuck there. But what happens in inferential confusion, is the generation of this doubt, is that there's a mistrust of the senses. So the person stops trusting these four senses, right? The physical senses, common sense, internal sense, and the real self, and goes into this world of imagination. So once you've stopped filtering by the senses, you get this flood of imaginary possibilities. And so there's this over-reliance on possibilities and a kind of belief that if it's possible, then it could be true. And then you're not filtering by relevance. And so using distorted kind of reasoning, a kind of a logic that makes sort of internal sense, but when you look at it objectively as distorted logic, then the OCD mind creates these really captivating, kind of almost movie-like scenarios, stories, a narrative that pulls in, out of context facts and hearsay and what the experts say and reverse reasoning to create this story that seems convincingly true. And it's usually associated with a sense of urgency, and the urgency to have to resolve this doubt is then what leads to the compulsions. But since the doubt is false and imaginary anyway, there's actually no way to resolve it. It's like arguing with a delusion. And I think the difference between this kind of OCD reasoning and delusions is that the person still has some insight. But it's a lot of the same kind of logical errors or distorted logic that are seen in delusions. So, for example, like, my friend, I heard my friend didn't lock their car, so maybe I didn't lock my car. Even though I heard the click, I saw the lock go down, like, but maybe somehow it isn't locked because I heard about someone not locking their car sometimes. So what we want to train people is to notice when they've gotten pulled into this imaginary realm and gotten away from the senses. And train people to come back into the senses and to be able to filter their imagination through the senses. And what that looks like in the room is basically a lot of psychoeducation and then a lot of practice. And what I think is brilliant is you do this when the person is not triggered, so that you want them to be relatively calm. And they first practice on other people's OCD. So someone with OCD has no problem seeing the reasoning problems in other people's OCD, and they practice with that before then practicing on their own. And then you help them develop their kind of reality-based story, their reality-based narrative that again they practice when they're not triggered, so that they have that kind of more reality-based story is anchored. So in the hand washing example, my hands are, I washed my hands once, as is a normal amount of time to do, and I trust that my hands are clean, and I know that I'm not going to be spreading particles around the room, and that I can go and enjoy my meal and have nutritious food. And so you build up a reality-based narrative that they practice again when they're calm, so that when they get the pull into the OCD narrative, they have something to come back to. Um, and yeah, maybe I'll just stop there. And Kim, if you have more to add or anything else you wanted to say, I'd love to hear your perspective on that explanation.
Yeah, you did such a beautiful job. The only thing that which I found fascinating, was to really work with the clients on the external or internal prompt, that there's always a prompt, something that happens before the obsessional doubt. And I thought that was really interesting. And when I've worked with clients on this, and I didn't think I would ever be able to get them there, they do. There is this external or internal prompt that happens before the obsessional doubt.
Yeah, right, exactly. So one of the first things you have them do is what they call these sequences. So you map out what's the trigger, that's the prompt, what's the doubt, what's the feared consequence, what's the distress, and then the compulsion. And again, traditional treatments focus on those last three things, right? You could think like yeah, last three, and then the OCD, the i-CBT is focusing on this obsessional doubt and seeing the link to the trigger. And it's also it was interesting to kind of think about what is OCD versus other anxiety disorders, because they're different. Like, and you can have more than one. So in OCD, the doubt is 100% imaginary. It's 100% irrelevant. It's like you've gotten sucked into the brain's horror movie. And once you kind of see that and can undo it, you pop out of it, there's no horror movie. Generalized anxiety is a sort of exaggerated anxiety response to realistic doubt, right? Normal uncertainty that someone has a hard time tolerating. So, in generalized anxiety, we do a lot with, distress tolerance, right? And helping people tolerate the sensations of being anxious, and exposure work, right? So they can, kind of have more equanimity around that. So I thought that's interesting. Yeah, this distinction between like OCD doubt and normal doubt, generalized anxiety, kind of intolerance of uncertainty, and then OCD doubt.
Thanks, Heather. Thanks, Kim. A lot of dots are getting connected in my brain as I'm learning with you about this. One of the dots that got connected, which I hadn't even realized was waiting to get connected, was the fact that most everyone I treat for OCD has a very fraught relationship to their physical body. So I just observed that. Some patients tell me, I hate my body. If I could not have a body, that would be the life for me. But even if it doesn't get to that level of hatred, there's a great unease with being embodied, being physical, with looking and sounding and smelling like we do. And I think I'm understanding now that a core piece of OCD is a flight from the senses, a flight from the body. I'd not seen that before.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I I mean, I'm trying to think if I've had that experience with my clients with OCD, and they certainly, I mean, I have a relatively small sample, but I would say they're often, yeah, they're in their head, right? There's a lot of thinking going on. I don't know, Kim, have you noticed that?
It's interesting that you said that because I never put that together, but one particular person who I'm working with now on OCD, um, is really uncomfortable with her body, and her OCD themes have nothing to do with her body, but it's interesting you said that. So it's something that I'm going to explore with her. So I never made that connection, but maybe. Yeah. The other interesting thing with this infant-based one, it has some similarities to how I think David Burns treats it in terms of the vulnerable self and the feared self. That kind of reminds me of the hidden emotion technique,
Mm.
because if you can identify that, it's very helpful for them in terms of dealing with their OCD.
Thanks for mentioning that, Kim. Yeah, a key part of this is that everyone, all of us have a vulnerable self, some way that we worry that our self is, and then OCD can click into that and create this feared self. And you can figure that out by looking at the types of doubts and feared consequences and kind of identifying a common theme. And it can be this really, it's sort of like the downward arrow when you hit a pathogenic belief and you're like, oh, like suddenly it makes a lot of sense why all these fears are coming out because there's this particular kind of vulnerable self theme. And so people like, there's harm, like some people will be afraid of harming other people, right? And so they may have a fear about being overly aggressive and it turns into this fear that I could stab my child. And you don't know, is that a fear? Like if someone comes in with a fear of stabbing their child, it could be, again, that they fear about taking up too much space and being overly aggressive. It could be a fear that they worry that they enjoy aggression. It could be a fear of being out of control and being someone who's out of control. So you kind of work with it until the person finds the one that really seems to fit with their fears.
Elizabeth, I saw you nodding your head as Heather and Kim were speaking. What's coming up for you?
Well, I agree. I was just, what Heather was talking about in the last minute about the connection of the aggression fears. There's multiple things. Regarding your question, and I was just kind of thinking, because I've treated a fair amount of OCD, and I don't remember, not too many people talk so much about their hatred for their body. And so then I thought, gosh, does that mean I haven't explored it far enough? Maybe it exists because it's easy to just focus on the OCD, the obsessions and the compulsions. And what would it be like if you just kind of explored this? Would that help identify the prompt more? I'm familiar with this type of OCD and I've tried it through the years, but I must admit, Heather, you're explaining it in quite an elegant way. And there are little things that are now really connecting that I hadn't, even with some of the literature I've read about it and tried it. So the prompt really strikes me as something like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And the body thing makes sense in that many people are disconnected from their bodies. I work with. And does that mean they necessarily hate their body? Sometimes it's trauma. Sometimes they're just in their heads and they just don't even know they have a body. So I'm curious about this, the connection of the senses, a flight from their senses and their body and the relationship to how much they like being in their body or their body. I haven't really explored that. It's interesting.
I mean, as you say that, Elizabeth, I mean, yeah, a huge amount of our wisdom about ourselves comes from reading body sensations, right? And if you lose that information, then what do you have to make up for it is the imagination. And and there is this link between OCD and trauma, right? So I mean, certainly I don't know the research on this, but I certainly have seen a number of people with trauma who also have OCD. I wonder if that's a vulnerability developing that. Yeah, if you don't feel safe to feel your body sensations, you're really vulnerable to kind of having this other process take over. I think so. I don't feel like I'm expert enough. Kim, and you sort of linked that, right? Hidden emotion as being similar to the feared self.
So what I understand is that um, your OCD will manifest in a way that will challenge your vulnerable and feared self. So you'll have a particular kind of OCD because you're afraid. Let's say you're a person who um, is worried about being in relationships. So you'll have, am I lovable, right? Maybe that's your feared self. Am I a lovable person? So it will manifest in, relationship OCD. So why, and you might ruminate about those thoughts. So why is it that and not contamination OCD? Why is it not another type of OCD? So that vulnerable feared self, which is kind of like a version of the hidden emotion, your OCD will always attack and come up to what you value most, and that is your vulnerable and feared self.
It's so interesting because I think there's also this issue of the secondary way that the mind makes use of the OCD symptom, which is I can't quite connect that with the feared self, but certainly we're hidden emotion, right? If you don't want to feel anger, then you compulse and you're anxious and your brain is taken up with that, and it's a protection against feeling an emotion that feels scary. Or I treated a guy many years ago before I knew team, and he had a hand washing phobia, and it was he dropped out of treatment when his father called me and really wanted me to get him treated. And it was clear that the hand washing was serving this sort of secondary function around like maintaining autonomy from his father. And he wasn't going to give that up. So I think it would be important to kind of do a magic button kind of experiment. Like, if you press a magic button and you lose your OCD symptoms, what else might you lose? Like, is there some other way that this is actually serving you that's important for us to understand?
Yeah, I remember Daniel talking about the cases he had with OCD. There was always some kind of disruption of their developmental process, right? So, is that right, Daniel? Do I have that correct? And that it seems like that was the case with the few people that I worked with, that something was preventing them from making a decision, taking the next step in their adult lives.
Yeah, right, Carol. We could view the onset of OCD in many ways. Elizabeth enlightened us to some biologic triggers that emerge in young people. But oftentimes, it seems to me that it's a developmental opportunity that the person is stepping back from. Instead of going to school, instead of doing the job, instead of entering the relationship, they're holding back and worrying about both sides as a maladaptive form of decision making. So probably that's more in evidence in some cases than in others. We wouldn't paint OCD with a single brush, but I'm loving the diversity of view that's emerging here, and very much appreciate, Heather, you're bringing this other resource to us. I wonder, Yuta, before we move on, do you have anything to add or subtract? Or
No, just very thankful for this additional. I heard about inference once and the clarifications that Heather gave, and also with the guide with the ROCD was really relationship was really enlightening. I just wanted to mention something that is a bit sidetracked about, and I use the classical response, not to use the ritual and engage in the anxiety model. In Israel, there are ethnic groups that don't like psychiatrists or medications. But being a social worker and a counselor, I don't diagnose, but obviously he was behaving as an adolescent at school. It's in the public service as OCD, and he had this idea somebody took a picture of me when I was naked or whatever. No evidence whatsoever, but it was related to a very young age sexual encounter he had with another boy, whatever. But OCD was real. I mean, a real problem. And I told the mother, maybe let's get him diagnosed. And he went to a psychiatrist, and they allowed me to speak with the psychiatrist. Oh, Yuda, yeah, of course, OCD, and I have this new medicine that is going to lower it so it can make your work so much easier. And so I was very happy about the combination of this supposedly good medication. But then they told me, no, he's not going to take it because they were very suspicious. So it took much longer than I suspect that with the help of the chemicals in this case, but we succeeded to separate well, I don't listen to my OCD, externalize it. I know it's all bullshit. There's no point on trying to refute it. It is just not listening to the constant noise in my head. And now he's doing much better. But it was funny for me because it was one time that I believed that the medication would have helped, and we lost a chance because of and maybe they are right, who knows? But it took 2 years instead of once I had a case with medication that was much faster. So maybe something I want to ask Heather actually if she believes as a psychiatrist that there are some medications that can really help in calming a bit what's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very pragmatic about medications that if they help, then that's great. I don't believe that there's like a deficiency or that they're correcting anything. But yeah, if someone is so dysregulated, I mean, actually, this young man that I was talking about, he wasn't sleeping. I was actually quite worried. I was kind of scared he could get suicidal. He was so distressed, and gave him a old-fashioned antidepressant to help him sleep. And he took it for a few doses and calmed right down. And I was really grateful that I had access to that. And yeah, SSRIs I think can be very helpful for some people. They don't work for everybody, but when they work, they can work beautifully. And then the person is again calm enough to actually engage in the therapy. And unlike exposure work, right, with i-CBT, actually it's better if they're calmer and not triggered. So
Thanks.